Eleanor Harper lived a quiet, predictable life in a small town surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where days passed slowly and nothing much ever happened. Eleanor liked it that way. She found comfort in routine. Every morning she would wake up early, water her garden, and then head to work at the local library. Her evenings were spent reading books or tending to the flowers she loved so much. Life was simple, peaceful, and safe, exactly how she preferred it. But all of that changed one rainy afternoon when a mysterious letter arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't just any letter. It was different from anything she had ever seen before. The envelope was old, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been handled many times over the years. There was no return address, no stamp, and no clear indication of who might have sent it. It simply appeared, sitting there among the usual bills and advertisements waiting for her to open it. At first, Eleanor didn't think much of it. She assumed it was some kind of promotional material or perhaps a misplaced note from a neighbor. But when she finally opened it later that evening, curiosity quickly turned into confusion, and then unease. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with one line written on it in shaky handwriting. "The truth lies beneath where your mother rests." Eleanor stared at the words, her heart pounding faster than she expected. What did it mean? And why now? Her mother, Margaret, had passed away 10 years ago, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. Everyone in town believed Margaret had died of a heart attack brought on by stress. It was tragic but straightforward, or so Eleanor had thought. Now, this cryptic message suggested otherwise. For hours, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter. She tried to convince herself it was a prank, maybe even a cruel joke played by someone who knew about her mother's death. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something about those words felt deliberate, almost urgent, as though whoever wrote them wanted her to take action. Her mind drifted back to her mother, recalling fragments of their life together. Margaret had always been a private person, rarely sharing details about her past. Even as a child, Eleanor remembered sensing that her mother carried secrets, things she chose not to talk about. Margaret often seemed preoccupied, lost in thought, especially during the last few months of her life. People whispered about her behavior back then, speculating about what might have been troubling her. Some said she was dealing with financial problems. Others hinted at something darker. But no one really knew for sure. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face, the same warm smile she remembered from childhood, but tinged now with mystery. She replayed the events leading up to Margaret's death, searching for clues she might have missed. Had her mother been hiding something? Was it possible that her passing hadn't been as natural as everyone believed? By morning, exhaustion gave way to resolve. Eleanor decided she needed answers, no matter how unsettling they might be. If the letter was telling her to look beneath where her mother rests, then that's exactly what she would do. She would visit the cemetery where Margaret was buried and see for herself if there was any truth to the message. The idea of digging up her own mother's grave filled Eleanor with dread. It felt wrong, disrespectful even, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than her fear. She convinced herself that she wouldn't actually disturb the coffin, at least not yet. First, she would go to the cemetery, stand by the headstone, and try to make sense of the situation. Maybe seeing the grave in person would spark some clarity. Before heading out, Eleanor borrowed a shovel from her neighbor's shed under the pretense of doing yard work. She didn't want anyone asking questions, not until she understood what was going on. As she drove to the cemetery, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. The sky was overcast, matching the heaviness in her chest. When she arrived, the graveyard was eerily silent, save for the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Standing before her mother's headstone, Eleanor felt a mix of emotions, grief, guilt, and determination. She traced the engraved letters of her mother's name with her fingers, whispering softly, "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know what's happening, but I need to find out." Taking a deep breath, she glanced around to ensure no one was watching. Then, gripping the shovel firmly, she began to dig. Each thrust into the ground felt heavier than the last, her muscles straining against the weight of both the task and her conscience. Dirt flew around her, staining her clothes and hands. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing instead on the rhythm of the shovel cutting through the earth. As the hole grew deeper, memories flooded back, her mother teaching, her how to bake cookies, their laughter echoing through the kitchen, the way Margaret used to hum while knitting scarves during winter nights. These moments were precious, yet they now seemed overshadowed by the growing suspicion that her mother's life had been far more complicated than she'd ever let on. Finally, after what felt like hours, the shovel struck something solid. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she cleared away the remaining soil, revealing the wooden lid of the coffin. Her heart raced as she stared at it, torn between fear and anticipation. Whatever lay inside could change everything she thought she knew about her mother, and possibly about herself. With trembling hands, Eleanor pried open the coffin lid, unsure of what she might find. For a moment she hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Then, summoning all her courage, she leaned forward to look inside. What she saw left her gasping for air, not because of horror, but because of shock. Lying beneath the decaying fabric of her mother's burial gown was a small metal box, rusted but intact. It was clear that someone had placed it there intentionally, hidden away for reasons unknown. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she carefully lifted the box out of the coffin. Brushing away layers of dirt and grime, she examined it closely. Faint engravings covered its surface, numbers, symbols, and patterns she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she opened the box, revealing a collection of documents tied together with a faded ribbon. Letters, photographs, and handwritten notes spilled onto her lap, each item hinting at a secret life her mother had kept hidden. Sitting cross-legged on the damp ground, Eleanor began to sift through the contents, her mind reeling with questions. Who had sent the letter? Why had her mother gone to such lengths to conceal these items, and most importantly, what did it all mean? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the graveyard, Eleanor realized she was only at the beginning of a journey that would unravel decades of lies and bring her closer to understanding the woman her mother truly was. The night was cold, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped into Eleanor's bones as she stood over the freshly dug grave. Her hands trembled, not just from the physical exertion of digging, but from the weight of what she had uncovered. The metal box sat in her lap, its rusted surface glinting faintly under the pale light of the moon. She felt like she was holding something fragile yet explosive, a Pandora's box that could either answer all her questions or shatter her world completely. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She glanced around the cemetery, again, half expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. But the graveyard remained eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what secrets would emerge from the past. Her fingers brushed against the lid of the box once more, hesitating before she finally opened it fully. Inside were stacks of papers, yellowed with age, tied neatly with a faded ribbon that might have once been bright red. There were also photographs, some black and white, others slightly faded color prints. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Snapshots of people smiling, standing in front of landmarks or gathered around tables, but something about them felt off. They weren't casual family photos. They looked staged, almost posed, as though the subjects knew they were being documented for a specific purpose. One photograph caught Eleanor's eye immediately. It showed her mother, Margaret, much younger than Eleanor remembered her, standing next to a man who looked vaguely familiar. He was tall, with sharp features and an intense gaze that seemed to pierce through the camera lens. His arm rested casually on Margaret's shoulder, but there was nothing casual about the way he held himself. He exuded authority, confidence, and maybe even danger. Eleanor studied the image closely, trying to place him. Had she seen him somewhere before? Or was this simply another face from her mother's mysterious past? Beneath the photographs were letters, dozens of them folded neatly and stacked inside the box. Some were written in elegant cursive handwriting, while others appeared hastily scribbled, as though their author had been in a rush. Eleanor unfolded one of the letters carefully, smoothing out the creases. The words were cryptic, filled with phrases she didn't understand. Operation Red Dawn, Safe House Coordinates, and Project Eclipse. None of it made sense, but each line hinted at something far bigger and far darker than Eleanor had anticipated. As she read through the letters, a pattern began to emerge. Many of them referenced code names and locations, along with warnings to stay low and avoid contact unless absolutely necessary. One letter in particular stood out. It was addressed directly to Margaret and signed by someone named Victor Kane. The tone was urgent, almost desperate. "Margaret, you need to disappear. They're onto us. If they find you, they'll kill you and anyone close to you. Burn everything that ties you to this life. Trust no one, not even me." Eleanor's stomach churned as she read those words. Who was Victor Kane? And who were they? The letter suggested her mother had been involved in something dangerous, something that required her to erase her identity entirely. But why? And how had Eleanor gone her entire life without knowing any of this? She continued sorting through the contents of the box, her movements slow and deliberate. Among the papers, she found a small notebook, its cover worn and cracked. Flipping it open, she discovered it was a journal of sorts, filled with Margaret's handwriting. Unlike the formal language of the letters, the entries in the journal were deeply personal, raw with emotion. They spoke of fear, guilt, and love. A mother torn between duty and family. In one entry, dated just weeks before Margaret's supposed death, she wrote, "I can't keep running. I've done things I'm not proud of, things I'll never be able to explain to Eleanor, but I did it for her safety. If anything happens to me, I hope she'll forgive me. I hope she'll understand that I only ever wanted to protect her." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she read those words. For years, she had believed her mother's passing was tragic but inevitable, a result of stress and poor health. Now she realized it might have been something else entirely, an act of sacrifice, a final attempt to shield her daughter from harm. By the time Eleanor finished going through the box, dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Exhausted but unable to sleep, she packed the documents back into the box and placed it carefully in the trunk of her car. As she drove home, her mind raced with possibilities. Who could she trust with this information? Should she go to the police? Or was it safer to investigate on her own? Back at her house, Eleanor spread the contents of the box across her kitchen table, organizing them into piles based on type, letters, photographs, and notes. She spent hours poring over every detail, searching for connections, patterns, or anything that might point her in the right direction. The more she learned, the clearer it became that her mother hadn't been an ordinary woman. She had lived a double life, one hidden beneath layers of secrecy and deception. One name kept appearing repeatedly: Victor Kane. Whoever he was, he seemed to play a central role in whatever operation Margaret had been part of. Determined to learn more, Eleanor decided to track him down. Using the resources available at the library where she worked, she began researching public records, old newspaper articles, and government archives. It wasn't easy. Many of the files she needed were classified or missing altogether, but bit by bit, she pieced together fragments of the puzzle. What she discovered shocked her. Victor Kane had been a high-ranking intelligence officer during the Cold War, known for his involvement in covert operations targeting enemy agents. According to declassified documents, he had disappeared shortly after retiring from service, leaving behind rumors of betrayal and corruption. Several sources mentioned a mission called Project Eclipse, though details were scarce. All Eleanor knew for certain was that her mother's name had somehow been linked to it. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Eleanor decided to reach out to people who might have known her mother personally. She started with distant relatives, then moved on to former colleagues and acquaintances. Most dismissed her inquiries, claiming ignorance or refusing to talk. But one elderly woman, a retired teacher who had been friends with Margaret, offered a tantalizing clue. "I always suspected your mother was involved in something important," the woman said, her voice trembling with age. "She used to receive strange phone calls late at night, and sometimes she'd leave town for days without explanation. Once I asked her about it, and she just smiled and said, 'It's better if you don't know.' After that, I stopped asking." Encouraged by this lead, Eleanor pressed further, eventually tracking down two other individuals who claimed to have worked alongside Margaret in some capacity. Their stories painted a picture of a woman who was brilliant, resourceful, and fiercely loyal, but also deeply conflicted. One man described Margaret as a ghost, someone who could slip in and out of situations without leaving a trace. Another referred to her as the key to dismantling a powerful criminal organization operating under the radar. Each conversation brought Eleanor closer to understanding the scope of her mother's involvement, but also raised new questions. Why had Margaret chosen to fake her death? What had happened to Victor Kane? And most importantly, what had become of Project Eclipse? Despite the growing complexity of the mystery, Eleanor refused to give up. She sensed that she was nearing the truth, and with each revelation she felt a mix of emotions. Grief for the mother she thought she knew, admiration for the woman she was beginning to uncover, and anger at the forces that had driven Margaret to such extremes. Whatever the cost, Eleanor vowed to see this through, to honor her mother's memory by uncovering the full story, no matter how painful it might be. Eleanor's investigation had taken her deeper into her mother's mysterious past than she ever imagined possible. Each new discovery felt like a thread pulling at the fabric of her reality, unraveling the life she thought she knew, and replacing it with something far more complex and dangerous. The documents from the metal box were only the beginning. They hinted at a web of secrets that stretched across decades, involving people whose names Eleanor didn't recognize, but who clearly held power and influence. Determined to uncover the truth, she decided to follow one of the most promising leads, a safe house mentioned in Margaret's journal. The journal entry describing the safe house was brief, but intriguing. Written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting, it read, "If you're reading this, go to the cabin. Everything I couldn't carry is hidden there. Trust no one." Beneath the note was a set of coordinates scribbled hastily in the margins. Eleanor traced the numbers with her fingers, her heart pounding as she realized this might be the key to unlocking the rest of the mystery. If the safe house truly existed, it could hold answers, perhaps even evidence, that would explain everything. Using an old map she borrowed from the library, Eleanor plotted the coordinates. To her surprise, they pointed to a remote location deep in the mountains, miles away from civilization. The area wasn't marked on any modern maps, suggesting it had been deliberately omitted or forgotten over time. This remoteness only fueled Eleanor's determination. If her mother had gone to such lengths to hide something, it must have been important. Preparing for the journey wasn't easy. The road to the mountains was rugged and poorly maintained, requiring a sturdy vehicle and careful planning. Eleanor packed supplies, food, water, flashlights, and tools, knowing she might not return for days. She also brought along copies of the documents she'd gathered so far, hoping they might help her decipher whatever she found at the safe house. As she drove out of town early one morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, she felt a mix of excitement and dread. She was about to step into the unknown, and there was no telling what awaited her. The drive itself was grueling. Narrow dirt roads twisted through dense forests, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Every bump and pothole jolted her small car, testing her resolve. At times, the path seemed to disappear entirely, forcing her to navigate by instinct and landmarks. Hours passed and the landscape grew wilder, more untamed. By the time she reached the coordinates, late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. What she found wasn't exactly what she expected. The cabin described in the journal was little more than a dilapidated shack, its wooden walls warped and splintered from years of neglect. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen leaves, and several windows were boarded up. Vines crept up the sides, reclaiming the structure as part of the forest. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a place where time had stopped. Eleanor approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching softly on the dry earth. The air smelled of damp wood and pine needles, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of wildlife. She half expected someone or something to emerge from the shadows, but the cabin remained still and silent. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shafts of light streaming through cracks in the walls and ceiling. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to make her sneeze as she moved. Further in, the space was sparsely furnished, a rickety table, a few chairs, and a cot shoved into one corner. But there were signs of recent activity. Someone had been here, though not recently. A pile of blankets lay crumpled on the floor, and a lantern sat on the table, its glass smudged but intact. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything unusual. Then she noticed it. A loose floorboard near the back wall, slightly raised as if it had been tampered with. Dropping to her knees, Eleanor pried it open with her hands, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside was a small, locked chest, its metal surface tarnished but otherwise undamaged. Her pulse quickened as she examined it. This had to be what her mother had hidden all those years ago. But the chest was locked, and there was no obvious keyhole. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Eleanor rummaged through the cabin looking for something that might help her open it. In a dusty drawer, she found a collection of old tools, including a thin, rusted screwdriver. Using it, she carefully worked at the lock, twisting and prying until it finally gave way with a soft click. When she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Inside the chest was a treasure trove of items: photographs, handwritten notes, and a small recording device wrapped in cloth. But what caught her attention first was a stack of files labeled Project Eclipse. Flipping through them, she saw detailed reports, diagrams, and lists of names, all coded in a language she didn't understand. Some pages were marked with red stamps reading classified, while others contained sketches of buildings and maps dotted with X's. Among the files was a cassette tape, its label faded but legible. For Eleanor, if you find this. Her hands trembled as she held it, realizing her mother must have left it specifically for her. Setting aside the other contents of the chest, she inserted the tape into the recorder and pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the room, calm but tinged with urgency. Eleanor, my sweet girl, if you're listening to this, then I'm gone. I want you to know how much I love you and how hard I've tried to protect you. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but it's the truth and you deserve to know it. Years ago, I became involved in a mission known as Project Eclipse. Its purpose was to expose a powerful criminal syndicate operating within our government. We uncovered evidence of corruption, betrayal, and plans for something catastrophic, something that could have destroyed countless lives. But we were betrayed. Our operation was compromised and many of us were targeted. I faked my death to keep you safe, to ensure you wouldn't become collateral damage in their revenge. Everything I've done has been for you, Eleanor. Please, forgive me. The message ended abruptly, leaving Eleanor stunned. Tears streamed down her face as she replayed the tape, clinging to the sound of her mother's voice. It was both heartbreaking and illuminating, confirming her suspicions while raising even more questions. Who had betrayed her mother? And what had happened to the others involved in Project Eclipse? Determined to find out, Eleanor turned her attention to the remaining contents of the chest. The photographs showed her mother alongside other operatives, their faces serious, their expressions guarded. One image featured Victor Kane prominently, his arm draped over Margaret's shoulders as they stood in front of a large estate. The back of the photo, someone had written, "Safe House Meeting, June 1985. The handwritten notes were equally revealing. They detailed meetings, strategies, and contingency plans, often referencing individuals by code names. Eleanor recognized some of the aliases from the letters she'd found earlier, piecing together fragments of the operation bit by bit. Slowly, A picture began to form. Project Eclipse had been a daring attempt to dismantle a shadowy network of criminals and corrupt officials. But something had gone terribly wrong, leading to the deaths or disappearances of nearly everyone involved. As night fell, Eleanor lit the lantern and continued sifting through the materials. She knew she couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Eventually, she would need to leave and decide what to do next. But for now, she allowed herself to sit quietly, surrounded by her mother's legacy. For the first time, she felt connected to Margaret, not just as a daughter, but as someone entrusted with carrying forward a vital mission. Whatever dangers lay ahead, Eleanor resolved to see it through. Her mother had sacrificed everything to protect her, and now it was her turn to honor that sacrifice by exposing the truth. The next morning, Eleanor woke up in the cabin, her body stiff from sleeping on the cold wooden floor. The lantern had burned out during the night, leaving the room cloaked in shadows until sunlight seeped through the cracks in the walls. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes and taking a deep breath. Her mind was still reeling from everything she'd learned the previous day. The recording, the photographs, the coded documents. It all felt overwhelming, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, waiting to be assembled into something coherent. But one thing was clear. Her mother's life had been far more complicated and dangerous than Eleanor could have ever imagined. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay in the mountains forever. She needed to act quickly, not just for herself, but for the sake of uncovering the truth. If Project Eclipse was as significant as the documents suggested, then the people involved, or those who had betrayed them, might still pose a threat. And if anyone found out that she had discovered these secrets, she could be in grave danger. But before she could move forward, she needed answers. Who were the key players? What had gone wrong with the mission? And most importantly, what had happened to Victor Kane? With renewed determination, Eleanor packed up the contents of the chest carefully, ensuring nothing was left behind. She wrapped the files, photographs, and recording device in cloth and secured them in her bag. Then, after one last glance around the cabin to make sure she hadn't missed anything, she locked the door behind her and began the long drive back to town. The journey home gave her time to think, to process everything she'd uncovered so far. By the time she arrived, she had formulated a plan. Her first step was to decode the information in the documents. Many of the files were written in shorthand, or contained symbols she didn't recognize, making them difficult to interpret. At the library where she worked, Eleanor had access to resources that might help. She spent hours poring over books about cryptography, learning how codes were created and broken. Slowly, she started identifying patterns in the notes using context clues to decipher their meaning. It was tedious work, requiring patience and focus, but each breakthrough brought her closer to understanding the full scope of Project Eclipse. One name kept appearing repeatedly in the decoded messages: Victor Kane. He seemed to be central to the operation, acting as both a leader and a liaison between the operatives and higher authorities. Some entries praised his strategic brilliance, while others hinted at tension within the group, suggesting disagreements over tactics or trust. Eleanor became increasingly convinced that finding Victor Kane was crucial to piecing together the rest of the story. If he was still alive, he might hold the missing answers. If he wasn't, well, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. Tracking down someone who had vanished decades ago wasn't easy, especially since much of the information about him was classified or redacted. Eleanor decided to start small, reaching out to former colleagues of her mother's who might have known him personally. She tracked down addresses and phone numbers, calling or visiting whenever possible. Most of the people she contacted were elderly now, their memories foggy and fragmented. But even partial recollections proved valuable. One man, a retired engineer named Harold, remembered Victor vividly. He was a clever devil, Harold said, leaning back in his chair and adjusting his glasses. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. Your mother trusted him completely, though I never understood why. There was something off about him, like he had secrets of his own. Another woman, a former teacher named Ruth, recalled meeting Victor briefly at a gathering hosted by Margaret. He was charming, yes, but there was an edge to him. You could tell he'd seen things most people couldn't stomach. Still, he cared deeply about your mother. That much was obvious. These conversations painted a picture of a man who was both brilliant and enigmatic, a figure who inspired loyalty, yet remained shrouded in mystery. But none of them could provide concrete information about what had happened to him after the mission fell apart. Frustrated but undeterred, Eleanor expanded her search, scouring old news articles, government archives, and even online forums dedicated to Cold War history. Eventually, she stumbled upon a lead that sent chills down her spine. In a dusty corner of the local historical society's archive, Eleanor found a newspaper clipping dated shortly after her mother's supposed death. The headline read, "Former intelligence officer presumed dead after plane crash." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of Victor Kane, identified as the sole passenger aboard a private aircraft that had disappeared over international waters. No wreckage had ever been recovered, and the incident had been ruled an accident. But something about the article didn't sit right with Eleanor. The timing was too convenient, just weeks after Margaret had faked her death. Was it possible that Victor had staged his own disappearance, just as her mother had done? Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Kane was still alive, hiding, somewhere under a new identity. If he was, finding him wouldn't be easy. She needed leverage, something that would convince him to come forward without putting herself in jeopardy. That's when she remembered the recording device. Among the audio files stored on it was another message, one addressed directly to Victor. In it, Margaret pleaded with him to protect Eleanor if anything happened to her, emphasizing the importance of keeping her daughter safe. It was heartfelt and urgent, a mother's final plea to a trusted ally. Realizing this could be her ticket, Eleanor copied the message onto a portable USB drive and drafted a letter. She mailed it to several locations associated with Victor's past, addresses linked to properties he once owned, post office boxes listed in old records, and even a few dead drops mentioned in the documents. The letter was brief, but direct. "Know you're alive. My mother left this message for you. If you care about her legacy, contact me. Time is running out." For days, Eleanor waited anxiously, checking her phone and email constantly for any sign of a response. She half expected to hear nothing, assuming Victor, if he was indeed alive, would ignore her attempt to reach him. But then, late one evening, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and cryptic. "Meet me tomorrow at noon. Come alone, bring the files." Below it was an address, a cafe in a nearby city. Eleanor's heart raced as she stared at the screen. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward. Whoever had sent the message clearly knew about the files, which meant they were either Victor himself or someone closely connected to him. Either way, she was about to face the person who held the final piece of the puzzle. The next day, dressed in plain clothes and carrying only the essential documents, Eleanor arrived at the cafe early. She chose a seat near the window, sipping coffee nervously as she scanned the room for anyone suspicious. At exactly noon, a man walked in. He was older than she expected, his hair streaked with gray and lines etched deeply into his face. But there was no mistaking those sharp features, that intense gaze. It was Victor Kane. He approached her table cautiously, sliding into the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a low voice, Victor broke the silence. "You look just like her," he said, his tone softening. "Margaret would be proud of you." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes, but she blinked them away, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Tell me everything," she said firmly. "Start from the beginning." And so, Victor began to speak, unraveling the tangled threads of Project Eclipse. He explained how the mission had aimed to expose a criminal syndicate embedded within the highest levels of government, a network responsible for countless atrocities, including assassinations, illegal arms deals, and covert experiments. They had gathered irrefutable evidence, enough to bring the organization crashing down. But betrayal had struck at the worst possible moment. Someone within their ranks had leaked their plans, tipping off the syndicate and forcing them to flee for their lives. We thought we'd covered our tracks. Victor admitted, his voice heavy with regret, but they were always one step ahead. Margaret made the ultimate sacrifice to protect you, Eleanor. She gave up everything, her freedom, her identity, so you could live safely. When I heard she was gone, I knew I had to disappear too. I've been lying low ever since, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Eleanor listened intently, absorbing every word. As Victor spoke, the pieces finally clicked into place. Her mother hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. She had been a hero, fighting against forces far greater than herself. The weight of that realization settled over Eleanor like a warm blanket, filling her with pride and sorrow in equal measure. When Victor finished, he handed her a flash drive. "This contains the rest of the evidence," he said. "It's encrypted, but you'll find instructions in the files your mother left behind. Use it wisely. Expose the truth, but be careful. These people don't forgive easily." Eleanor nodded, clutching the flash drive tightly. She knew what she had to do next. Armed with the knowledge and evidence she'd gathered, she was ready to take the final step, to confront the powers that had tried to erase her mother's legacy and ensure justice was served. The cafe grew quieter as the lunchtime crowd thinned out, leaving Eleanor and Victor sitting alone at their corner table. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air between them, a mix of relief, grief, and determination. For years, Eleanor had carried unanswered questions about her mother's life and death. Now, with Victor's revelations and the evidence on the flash drive, she finally had the tools to uncover the full truth. But knowing what to do next, and how to do it safely, was another challenge entirely. Victor leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his expression serious. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low but firm, "you need to understand something. These people, the ones we were trying to expose, they don't play fair. They have money, power, and connections that reach into every corner of society. If they find out you're onto them, they won't hesitate to silence you." Eleanor nodded, her jaw tightening. She had already suspected as much, but hearing it from Victor made it feel more real, more urgent. Still, fear wasn't going to stop her. Not now. Not after everything she'd discovered about her mother's sacrifice. "I'm not afraid of them," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "They took my mother away from me. They erased her life and tried to bury the truth. I owe it to her to make sure their crimes don't stay hidden." Victor studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. He seemed to see a reflection of Margaret in her strength, her resolve, her refusal to back down. Finally, he sighed and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notebook. "This is for you," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's a list of contacts, people who can help you if things get dangerous. Some of them are journalists, others are activists or whistleblowers. All of them have dealt with corruption before. Use them wisely." Eleanor accepted the notebook, with trembling hands tucking it carefully into her bag alongside the flash drive. "Thank you," she said softly. "But what about you? Are you coming forward too?" Victor shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No. My time for fighting has passed. Besides, I've been hiding for so long that stepping into the spotlight would only put us both at risk. You're stronger than you realize, Eleanor. Stronger than any of us ever were. This is your fight now." His words settled over her like a mantle, heavy but empowering. Eleanor knew she couldn't rely on anyone else to carry this burden. It was hers alone to bear. As she left the cafe and walked back to her car, her mind raced with plans. How could she use the evidence to expose Project Eclipse without putting herself or others in immediate danger? Who could she trust to amplify the story once it came to light? Over the next few days, Eleanor pored over the contents of the flash drive, using the instructions Victor had mentioned to decrypt the files. What she found inside was staggering. Video footage, audio recordings, financial records, and detailed reports documenting decades of illegal activities orchestrated by the criminal syndicate. There were names of politicians, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials, all complicit in covering up crimes ranging from embezzlement to murder. One file even outlined plans for a catastrophic event that had been narrowly averted thanks to Margaret's efforts. As she sifted through the material, Eleanor realized she needed to approach this strategically. Simply handing the evidence over to the authorities wouldn't be enough. Many of the individuals implicated likely held positions of power within the system itself. Instead, she decided to turn to investigative journalism, a field known for holding the powerful accountable. She reached out to several reporters whose work she admired, sharing snippets of the evidence and explaining its significance. To her surprise, one journalist, a seasoned investigator named Claire Bennett, agreed to meet with her. Claire was cautious at first, skeptical of Eleanor's claims. But as Eleanor laid out the documents and recounted her journey, from the mysterious letter to digging up her mother's grave to meeting Victor Kane, Claire's demeanor shifted. By the end of their conversation, she was visibly shaken. "If even half of this is true," Claire said, her voice tinged with awe, "it's the biggest story of the decade, maybe the century." Together they devised a plan. Claire would verify the authenticity of the evidence while Eleanor worked on building a narrative around it, one that honored her mother's bravery and highlighted the human cost of the syndicate's actions. They agreed to publish the story in stages, starting with smaller exposés to gauge public reaction before releasing the full scope of the corruption. It was risky, but necessary. Timing would be critical. They needed to strike when the syndicate least expected it. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor threw herself into the project, working tirelessly alongside Claire. They spent countless hours cross-referencing data, interviewing sources, and piecing together timelines. Slowly, a coherent picture emerged, not just of the syndicate's crimes, but of the courageous individuals who had fought against them. Margaret's role became central to the narrative, portrayed as a selfless hero who had risked everything to protect innocent lives. But the closer they got to publishing, the more Eleanor felt the strain. Strange cars began parking outside her house at odd hours. Her phone buzzed with unknown numbers late at night. Once she thought she saw someone watching her from across the street. She reported these incidents to Claire, who urged her to take precautions. "You're poking a hornet's nest," Claire warned. "We need to keep you safe until we release the story." To minimize risks, Eleanor moved temporarily to a secure location arranged by one of Claire's trusted contacts. From there, she continued collaborating remotely, finalizing the details of the exposé. Despite the mounting pressure, she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Every setback only fueled her determination to see this through. Finally, the day arrived. The first article went live online early in the morning, accompanied by a video detailing key findings from the investigation. Within hours, the internet exploded with reactions. Social media feeds lit up with hashtags calling for accountability. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach. Public outrage grew as more details emerged, forcing government officials to issue statements condemning the alleged crimes. For Eleanor, watching the world respond to her mother's legacy was bittersweet. She felt a surge of pride knowing that Margaret's sacrifices hadn't been in vain. Yet she also mourned the years stolen from them, the conversations they'd never had, the memories they'd never shared. Sitting alone in her temporary hideaway, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, clutching a photograph of her mother close to her chest. By evening, the fallout was undeniable. Arrest warrants were issued for high-ranking officials, named in the exposé. Protests erupted in major cities demanding justice and reform. And amidst the chaos, Eleanor received a call from Claire. "It's working," Claire said, her voice brimming with excitement. "People are listening, we're making a difference." Eleanor smiled faintly, though tears welled up in her eyes. "Good," she replied. "That's all I wanted, for the truth to come out." Though the battle wasn't over, Eleanor knew they had struck a decisive blow. The syndicate's grip on power was weakening, and for the first time in years, hope flickered on the horizon. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Eleanor faced them with renewed purpose. Her mother had taught her the value of courage and sacrifice, and now, armed with the truth, she was ready to carry that torch forward. The days following the release of the exposé were a whirlwind of emotions for Eleanor. The story had ignited a firestorm across the nation, sparking outrage, protests, and demands for accountability. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the implicated individuals while others resigned in disgrace. Law enforcement agencies launched investigations, raiding offices and seizing assets tied to the criminal syndicate. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up anger and frustration over corruption and injustice. For Eleanor, the attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her temporary hideaway, eager to interview the woman who had uncovered one of the biggest scandals in modern history. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Justice for Margaret" and "Expose the Truth," turning her mother into a symbol of bravery and resilience. Strangers reached out to share their own stories of loss and betrayal at the hands of powerful institutions. Through it all, Eleanor remained focused on the bigger picture, ensuring that the momentum didn't fade until real change occurred. Claire Bennett became an invaluable ally during this time, helping Eleanor navigate the chaos while continuing to break new developments in the case. Together, they worked tirelessly, publishing follow-up articles that delved deeper into specific aspects of the scandal. Each piece added another layer to the narrative, painting a clearer picture of how deeply entrenched the corruption was and how many lives it had destroyed. One particularly damning report revealed that funds stolen by the syndicate had been funneled into illegal arms deals, contributing to conflicts overseas. Another exposed a cover-up involving a catastrophic industrial accident that had killed hundreds, but was blamed on human error. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of their work became undeniable. Arrests mounted, trials were scheduled, and reforms were proposed. Yet despite the progress, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. While some perpetrators faced justice, others managed to slip through the cracks using their wealth and influence to evade consequences. She knew that dismantling such a vast network would take years, if not decades. But for now, she took solace in knowing they had dealt a significant blow, one that would ripple through generations. Amidst the turmoil, Eleanor found moments of peace. She returned to her home in the small town where she had grown up, grateful for its quiet simplicity after months of living under constant scrutiny. Neighbors who had once dismissed her as unremarkable now greeted her warmly, offering words of encouragement and admiration. At the library where she worked, patrons stopped by regularly to thank her for her courage. Though she appreciated their kindness, Eleanor struggled to reconcile her newfound fame with the life she had always known. In many ways, she felt like two different people: the quiet librarian who loved tending to her garden and the determined crusader who had unearthed a conspiracy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, Eleanor visited her mother's grave. The cemetery was peaceful, untouched by the storm raging beyond its gates. She knelt before the headstone, brushing away stray leaves and placing fresh flowers at its base. For a long time, she simply sat there staring at the engraved letters of her mother's name. "I did it, Mom," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "I found the truth. People know what you did, the sacrifices you made. They won't forget." Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of pride, of gratitude, for Margaret's strength, for her love, for the legacy she had left behind. Eleanor stayed there until the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, feeling a profound sense of closure. She realized that while the journey had been painful, it had also brought her closer to understanding her mother in ways she never thought possible. Margaret hadn't just been a parent. She had been a fighter, a protector, a beacon of hope in a dark world. And though Eleanor could never bring her back, she could honor her memory by continuing to stand up for what was right. In the months that followed, Eleanor dedicated herself to creating lasting change. Using the skills she had developed during the investigation, she founded a nonprofit organization aimed at supporting families affected by espionage-related trauma. The foundation provided resources, counseling, and advocacy for those whose loved ones had been caught in the crossfire of covert operations. It was a way for Eleanor to channel her grief into something constructive, ensuring that no one else had to endure the same pain and confusion she had experienced. She also collaborated with Claire on a book detailing the entire saga, from the mysterious letter that started it all to the groundbreaking exposé that shook the nation. Titled Beneath Where She Rests, the memoir served as both a tribute to Margaret and a call to action for readers. Proceeds from the book went directly to the foundation, furthering its mission of healing and empowerment. Though life eventually settled into a new rhythm, Eleanor never forgot the lessons she had learned along the way. She carried them with her every day, reminding herself that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. Her mother's courage had inspired her to dig deeper, to ask questions, and to seek justice, even when it seemed impossible. Now, Eleanor hoped to inspire others in the same way. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, Eleanor organized a memorial event at the cemetery. Friends, family, neighbors, and strangers gathered to pay their respects, sharing stories of how Margaret's legacy had touched their lives. As Eleanor stood before the crowd, looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of gratitude, not just for her mother, but for everyone who had supported her throughout this journey. "When I started this quest," she said, her voice steady and strong, "I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that I needed answers. What I found was so much more than I ever imagined, a story of sacrifice, resilience, and hope. My mother taught me that the truth matters, no matter how hard it is to find. And today, we honor her by continuing to fight for justice, transparency, and compassion." The applause that followed was heartfelt, echoing across the quiet graveyard. As Eleanor stepped down from the makeshift podium, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. Armed with her mother's legacy and the unwavering belief that truth could prevail, Eleanor walked forward into the future, not as the woman she used to be, but as the woman she had become. Brave, resilient, and unafraid to shine a light in the darkest corners of the world.